All right, joining me now is a gentleman I've had many conversations with over the years, always about unpleasant topics, unfortunately. But we have a really interesting one, not altogether unpleasant or pleasant, but part of the story of sports. My next guest, of course, is Karim Zidan. He is an investigative journalist who covers the intersection between sports and politics and has his own Substack. You can get that at Sports Politica. It is my friend Karim. It's Karim. I always mess up the pronunciation, but how are you, Karim?
You got it just fine, Luke. Don't even worry. It's great to see you again. It's been a while.
Likewise. Yes, it has, but long overdue. But part of the reason why we wanted to have this conversation is it's an important topic, but you were also highly requested as usual. So I had to answer the voice of the people. All right, let's talk about what's going on. Now, I realize it's more than just the country of Saudi Arabia, but let's start there. For people who may not know, what is Saudi Arabia doing with its vast wealth in terms of investment in the sporting world?
So this really started, Luke, around 2016 when Mohammed bin Salman at that point had sort of exercised a form of a coup d'etat, really, in stating himself as the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia.
Okay, yeah, I was about to say, for folks who don't know, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he is as you indicated, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. Go ahead.
Exactly. He positioned himself as the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He's obviously a member of the royal family, but he was definitely not in line for the throne, and that changed dramatically in 2015. So come 2016, and he starts announcing these plans for Vision 2030, which was sort of this blueprint for Saudi Arabia's technocratic future, sort of divesting away from oil and redirecting funds towards investment in business and tourism, expanding in sports and entertainment. So as I just mentioned, sports really played a significant a role there, and they immediately started venturing out to see what they could secure in the world of sports entertainment. One of the first big successes that Saudi Arabia had was securing a deal with the WWE, the World Wrestling Entertainment. And we started seeing events happening quite frequently starting from 2016. And of course, the WWE had visited Saudi Arabia beforehand, but that was really the new plan, and the new deal had only came in after Mohammed bin Salman. So really, it goes from there. Since then, they've continued to acquire and to hold incredible amounts of events and set themselves up as sort of this global hub for sports entertainment. Now, critics have, and I mean, I was definitely one of them, starting from 2016 onwards, labeled this as a form of sports washing. Sports washing being a term that describes how regimes can use and weaponize sports to distract from human rights abuses. But now, Luke, I'm here to tell you that I honestly think, not necessarily that I was mistaken there, but I think that there's far more to this than just sports washing, to be honest. I truly believe that Saudi Arabia's sports strategy here is extremely complex, extremely thorough, and very cunning when you really, really think about it. They are doing so much here through Vision 2030 and utilizing sports in the process. And just to list a few things, we've got, of course, the developing of different economic sectors, creating this global hub for tourism, and sports plays a large part in that. I was just in Egypt where, driving down the highway in Egypt, you've got this big billboard of Cristiano Ronaldo wearing the Al Nassr football jersey with the big logo next to it saying, "Visit Saudi Arabia." Now, of course, that's targeting the Arab world because that's part of the tourism. It's not always going to just be the Western world, and we'll get into that later. But tourism played a big role here in sports, and having somebody like Ronaldo and Neymar on their teams really, really factors in there. Really, this is also bread and circuses for Saudi's youth. I mean, you've got a population in Saudi Arabia, Luke, of, I think, 50% under the age of 35 in Saudi Arabia. That's a lot of young people, right? There's a lot of young people that you have to keep distracted, especially as you're opening up the country. Before, Saudi Arabia was so repressive, you couldn't open your mouth, you couldn't say a word. You were just expected to travel abroad if you had the capabilities to have fun. Now that people are able to do so in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, they're obviously going to start, expecting more. So by sort of offering them this wide range of entertainment, Mohammed bin Salman has sort of created this a social contract with his people, which is, I'm going to give you everything you wanted, all these things you've always dreamed about, all these things you've always seen everywhere, from all your favorites, Italian soccer teams, to all your favorite wrestlers that you watched growing up. I'm going to give you all of that. In exchange, you shut your mouth and you never say a word about politics or anything that I'm doing. That's the deal in place. Nobody got to sign on or sign off from this deal, but that's exactly the structure in place right now. Now, to expand politically speaking, I think the sports factor here has a significant diplomatic and sports diplomacy factor here. This is all about regional diplomacy and regional supremacy for Saudi Arabia. And it presents itself as such by suddenly out of the blue becoming this regional leader in the world of sports. It starts to compete with its regional rivals, mainly Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, which both have, and I think this is going to factor in a lot with our discussion about combat sports. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have a significant rivalry, and I'd really like to touch on that. And of course, this is all about prestige as well. So I'm sure we'll get into this all more, but I really think when we talk about Saudi sports and its strategy, we have to go beyond the term sports washing.
Okay. So a lot to unpack there. From the first side of it, and I want to be clear, we will touch on this a little bit. Obviously, the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund has funded here locally Monumental Sports and Entertainment, which, of course, is the Ted Leonsis company that owns the Washington Capitals of the NHL, the Washington Wizards, the Mystics of the NBA and WNBA, respectively. Putting that aside for just a moment, can you give me a sense of the scale of the sports investment from Saudi Arabia? You mentioned that their own league, they have invested vast sums to get Neymar, to get Cristiano Ronaldo. Obviously, we know they have done a deal with the PFL for $100 million, which seems like a pittance relative to even Neymar's wages, if we're being honest. But still, that's an investment just the same. What are some other places that this Saudi investment in sports has touched?
Oh, they have really, I think they're attempting to penetrate absolutely everything. When you think of, I mean, for me as an Egyptian, when Saudi Arabia first started to enter sports, they were trying to buy, local Egyptian teams like Al Ahly, which is, one of the most popular football teams in Africa and one of the most successful in Africa. They were starting so small at the time and, hosting a few WWE events. When you really think about it now, Luke, they are the premier destination for boxing events. They are about to host one of the most anticipated boxing fight, really one of the biggest heavyweight showdowns we can expect this generation. That was not something I expected. It wasn't on the bingo card for me for Saudi Arabia. Their investments are touching absolutely everything. They are significantly impacting the English Premier League, the leading and most prestigious football, soccer, whatever term we're going to use here, league in the world, right? I mean, Newcastle United just had an incredible performance in the Champions League against Paris Saint-Germain. Funnily enough, a geopolitical rivalry there as well with PSG being owned by Qatar. But put that aside for now, it was a phenomenal performance that goes to show you that they're not just throwing sums of money and expecting it to succeed, but they're actually strategically factoring this in, and their investments are calculated and well structured. Honestly, it's the fact that Newcastle United, which wasn't having any success for a few years, has suddenly earned a place in the Champions League and is actually doing really well right now. That goes to show you that this is not just about throwing money out there and hoping things work. Saudi Arabia actually has a plan in place, and it seems to be really achieving that. Luke, that's the staggering thing here. But you were asking me to sort of scale and put into perspective Saudi's sports investments. And I'm going to tell you honestly, they're not even investing that much in sports in comparison to their other investments. I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia is investing a lot more in US-based venture capital funds, for instance. They've invested, as far as I can tell so far, by 2022, $35 billion into venture capital funds in the United States. Now, this is, for those who don't necessarily believe me or who question if I'm exaggerating here, this was part of the discovery documents that were shown when the U.S. Senate Investigative Committee was investigating the deal between the PGA Golf League in the United States and Live Golf, the merger between them. These are some of the documents that came out that showed that the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, which is owned by Saudi Arabia and chaired by Mohammed bin Salman, has invested $35 billion into U.S.-based venture capital funds, listing them all from Sequoia onwards, right? So they are significantly infiltrating U.S. companies. And this is something that's completely gone under the radar because it's not as sexy as sports, right? They can invest a lot less money in sports and get a lot more attention. It goes to show you the value of sports, right? They've invested maybe a third of that in the sports world so far, maybe a bit more. Let's say even half of that. and it's getting far more attention. Let's take it a step further. They've invested more than they're expecting to spend more than $500 billion on this giant giga project that they have called Neom, this futuristic city that they're building in the middle of the
The
desert.
the long thin one, right?
Exactly, that's the one. That, I mean, it got some attention, not necessarily the most positive attention so far. People are more or less thinking, what on earth is this thing, and why is it so long and thin? But sure, uh, it's again, you spend that much money, you're not getting the attention that you're getting spending a pittance of that in the world of sports. Sports, at the end of the day, get people's attention. It's a polarizing topic for some, and it's a thing that people are so loyally attached to and very fond of, right? You're going to always get a reaction from people when it comes to sports, and that's something Saudi Arabia has realized.
And also, just one thing to note, I believe this is right. Obviously, for someone like Lionel Messi, for example, he ultimately had the opportunity to go for literally over $1 billion, I think, almost annually to compete in the Saudi League. Ultimately chose MLS, and everyone's like, well, that's great. But as I understand it, he is an ambassador for, not in a state capacity, but a informal kind of ambassador for Saudi tourism, right? I believe there's something to that.
Oh, he absolutely is. This is actually a piece I did for the New York Times a couple of months ago with my colleague Tariq Panja there. And what we ended up uncovering was by having access to Leo Messi's contract with the Saudi Arabian Tourism Authority, we were able to see the extent of the agreement actually between Leo Messi and the Saudi state or the Saudi government, which included millions of dollars being spent on social media posts, on Messi visiting the country with his family and posing with his family, vacationing in Saudi Arabia. Each of these instances where you see Messi posting on social media, on his Instagram, or visiting Saudi Arabia and you see the Saudis, the Saudi government posting all these pictures, all that is paid for, $2 million a piece each time. The total value of the contract came out to about $25 million over 3 years, which, mind you, Luke, honestly, if you're asking me personally, I think they got Messi at a steal of a price. My goodness, a steal of a price, because you really think of the size of his reach, right? His social media reach. It's priceless, the kind of promotion he's giving Saudi Arabia right now. I think they were winners no matter what. Whether they have him playing for the country, that would have been perfectly fine in the domestic league, but I think they're still winners because what they really wanted was the prestige of having Leo Messi promote them, really present their brand abroad and publicly speak in favor of Saudi Arabia. That's really the intent of this in the end. I bet you anything, Luke, that most of these other footballers have similar deals in their contracts. If I'm not mistaken, Neymar's deal with Saudi Arabia also includes payments to be given to him if he promotes Saudi Arabia, which he's already started to do. So at the end of the day, this is more than just having them play for the country. It's really about having them promote Saudi Arabia. And I would be remiss not to mention the fact that Messi's contract also included a clause that stated he cannot tarnish Saudi Arabia at all. Basically, it's a non-disparagement clause, right? And they are quite litigious, Saudi Arabia, right? This is exactly what we can expect in the future. People have always tell me, well, how is Saudi Arabia going to silence people? They're not going to kill Messi. Well, obviously they wouldn't kill Messi. There's no suggestion here that Saudi would use violence on any of these athletes or intimidate them in any such way. Why would they when they can just litigate against them, right? That's scary enough as it is, especially from a country like Saudi Arabia. We've seen the similar non-disparagement clause actually in the merger framework agreement between the PGA and Live Golf. And funny enough, Luke, it was only inserted in, I think, the fourth draft of the contract. So it wasn't even something that was initially there for those who think that this is just, standard practice for businesses. It most certainly is not. It's absolutely illegal. But it was inserted in the fourth round. So it goes to show you that this is something that Saudi's absolutely pushing for in many contracts and something that I'm hoping I'll be able to uncover in other contracts in the future. But it goes to show you this is how they intend to control the global narrative about them. It's not through intimidation. Well, it's not through at least physical intimidation, let's put it that way. It will be through litigation, and it will work.
Okay. You mentioned that there were other dimensions to it's more than just sports washing. I want to get to that in 1 second, but the last question on the sports washing side, the thing that I always encounter is pushback when folks being like, yeah, but no one really it's not, the argument that I receive is that, well, who cares because it's not working. People know Saudi Arabia still is a repressive, fanatical regime, but I don't really believe that. I actually do believe that it is working, or at a bare minimum, the question is not, is it working now? The question is it going to work 5 years from now when folks just sort of get normalized with the idea? So give me a sense, just on the sports washing angle, how successful have their sports investment been in getting a more receptive view or messaging from outside parties about Saudi Arabia?
I'll do that for you in 2 words, Luke. Jamal Khashoggi. It's really that simple, right?
Right.
As soon as Jamal Khashoggi, and for those who don't know, this is a Saudi dissident journalist who was really dismembered and assassinated by.
From the Washington Post, yeah.
Yes, exactly. It was for the Washington Post, and he was dismembered by the Saudi government. And this caused outrage worldwide. And this came right on the heels of Mohammed bin Salman's sort of reform campaign, where he was traveling around Western democracies, proclaiming himself a reformer of Saudi Arabia. And the media ate it up from the New York Times onwards, right? This happens sort of 6 months later with Jamal Khashoggi, and the world is outraged. I mean, you have Ari Emanuel decided to return an investment that Saudi Arabia had made into Endeavor at the time, right? He was the only one who took it to that extent, but that goes to show you just how outraged people were at the time. And guess who decided to continue hosting their events in Saudi Arabia? It was the WWE. Vince McMahon had, I believe, a event scheduled there. I can't remember if it was the Greatest Royal Rumble or something. It was a pay-per-view scheduled there a couple of weeks after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. And the U.S. government even attempted to intervene and to get Vince McMahon to not hold this event. He said, no, we're still going. And they did go. And I would argue, Luke, that to an extent, this helped normalize Saudi Arabia thereafter. More and more shows continued to happen between WWE and other sporting events. Nobody held off from Saudi Arabia. This goes to show you that sports washing does work. On the basic concept of reputation laundering, it does work. And it's not just about getting people to realize that, Saudi Arabia is committing human rights abuses. If you still go and work with them, then they've won already, right? Like, it's not just about recognizing that they've committed the human rights abuse. It's about stopping you from actually working with them. And if you're not going to stop doing that, well, then they're successful. Then the sports washing campaign has worked. And it works because at the end of the day, all these corporations, all these sports leagues, they're capitalist entities that want money. It's a pursuit for profit. And right now, no one has more money on offer than Saudi Arabia. It's the new gold rush, right? So it's always that in that side alone, it does work. It worked for Qatar 2022, the World Cup as well, because people could say, sure, we know that the human rights abuses took place, but you all still watched the tournament, didn't you? We all still watched the tournament. Plenty of people attended. People were proclaiming it the best World Cup ever. Then the sports washing worked. It doesn't matter if you know that the human rights abuses occurred. If there were no consequences thereafter, then it doesn't matter.
And I guess, okay, fair enough. Lastly, on the sports washing question, when another pushback I hear is that it's like, well, look, how can Western democracies sit here and lecture us about this, right? And listen, there is something to be said for that. Western democracies, I won't even get to the specifics, but even this week have not shown great moral courage or leadership really in a lot of different dimensions, and of course have a long history of any number of atrocities, colonial empires, you name it. Give me an argument that you believe is relevant about why doing business with the Saudi sovereign fund and the wealth that they're going to provide, why is this uniquely morally troubling in your view?
This question I think would have been easier to answer prior to this week, but right now I'm particularly troubled by what's going on and the responses from Western democracies, I have to admit, and it's making it much more difficult for me to come up with a coherent response here, but I will attempt to do so. And I'll speak generally for authoritarian versus democracy here for a second, Luke, which is what people have to understand when they're going into business with authoritarian regimes. They're not going into business with entities like they're used to in the United States. There is no legal recourse to be had if something goes wrong, right? You are in business with effectively gangsters. Effectively, you're in business with gangsters, and there's a lot of money to be had working with gangsters, but there's also a lot of terrible things that can occur. There was one, for instance, report. Let's go back to the WWE here for a second. I find this because I know you're not a big fan at all of the WWE,
but it's relevant. It's relevant, yeah.
Here, so we'll do that. There was a point where reports came out that WWE wrestlers had been held on a plane in Saudi Arabia and they weren't allowed to leave for multiple hours, and this was a significant problem. And many of these wrestlers thought they had been kidnapped. Nobody knew what was going on. They were basically held hostage in Saudi Arabia for a while. This is one of those stories that has yet to be, fully uncovered or understood, but it is to be believed that something did occur at that time. And I was asked recently by a reporter about this who's working on a story specifically on this. And I was asked a question, which is like, how do you think something like this could happen? I'm like, how did you think you were going to work with Saudi Arabia and not expect this to be potential consequence here if you pissed off Mohammed bin Salman? You are not in the United States where you can say what you want about Donald Trump and Joe Biden and not face any consequences, right? Like those are the things that I think people take for granted in democracies. The rule of law generally within the country. Again, we will always find examples where these things don't apply, right? But I'm saying in the grand scheme of things here, you have uh, bureaucracy, you've got institutional structures and you've got power not concentrated in the hands of just one person, right? That is extremely important. But when you're in an autocracy or a monarchy of such, or a military dictatorship like Egypt is, you are not operating under any regular laws or structures here whatsoever. So that's something people have to take into consideration, right? It works great for the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and FIFA, who are very much interested in working with autocrats because they can build more stadiums for them without having to go through getting agreements from, say, parliament or through referendums from their people, or having any of these discussions, or worrying about where the tax money is going to come from, right? So of course these big institutions want to work with something like Saudi Arabia. Of course it's going to be great to host a 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia. It's easier to work with an authoritarian regime than it is to work with a democracy. It is. So there is an argument to be made that this is always going to continue to take place. But I ask people here to understand that you're not dealing with entities like you're used to growing up in the West. You're not, there is no recourse. If something goes wrong, if human rights abuses are committed, there is nothing that's going to change that. We've seen that most recently in Qatar. People expected that the Qatari government claiming that they were going to make changes in, migrant workers and policies towards migrant workers, they expected that to be a fact. But as we've seen right now from stories that continue to come out about migrant workers being trapped there, unable to get paid and unable to even leave the country, that's just not how it works, right? Authoritarian regimes can do whatever they want. And take my word on this, I've grown up in them all my life. All my life. They do whatever they want. And we have no say in the matter, right? So it's very hard for me to ever support that structure. It's always going to be hard to do so. But right now is the hardest, is where I'm struggling to even make a case for the democratic countries, Luke, to be honest with you. And let's forget about this week. I'll use France as an example. France banning the wearing of hijabs. That is not democratic behavior, right? France passing these horrific privacy laws when it comes to AI, the usage of AI and facial recognition software and cameras for the upcoming Paris Olympics, doing so without Parliament's approval, that is authoritarian behavior. That is not the behavior of a democratic country. So there is a lot of hypocrisy here, and it's a question I am still struggling with, which is why we've had this long-winded answer here.
Okay, so now you mentioned there was a greater dimension beyond, hey, we're going to get Ronaldo to play for us. We're going to invest money in Newcastle, and this will give us shine and participation in sort of global communities that matter to us. You mentioned that there was something beyond that. Tell me what that is and why that matters.
Okay, so really, I believe at the end of the day, Luke, this is all about power, prestige, and Saudi Arabia's ability to control the global narrative really about itself, and just generally have a massive scope of influence. And it's already starting to earn that respect around the world from different people, right, from different countries. And it's not just happening in the Western world, it's happening in Asia as well, right? It's happening in the Middle East, it's happening in Africa. And I was just in Egypt now, where people are sort of admiring, some people are admiring what Mohammed bin Salman is building. They're saying, well, look at him standing up to the West, look at him being able to build a sports league and a domestic football league that's able to take and compete with the English Premier League, right? He is in many ways redefining Saudi nationalism, providing himself with a whole new plethora of opportunities for propaganda, right? He is emerging as one of the regional hegemons as well in the region. And sports has become one of those ways to emphasize this. Let's put it that way, to emphasize this. I'll give you a recent example of this. For those who don't know, Saudi Arabia and Iran have long been rivals. And earlier this year, Saudi Arabia and Iran had a historic agreement, let's say, that was brokered by China. And people saw this as groundbreaking, right? This was never expected to happen between these two countries. So now that there is sort of diplomatic relations between these two countries again, first time since 2016, Saudi Arabia had I can't remember the competition. I think the Asian Champions League was happening, the football tournament as well. And there were matches to be played between a Saudi domestic team and an Irani domestic team, and they were to be played in Tehran. And the Saudi team was Al Nasr, and Saudi Arabia took Ronaldo to Iran. And if you see the videos, Luke, of the crowds in Tehran gathering.
I did. Outside his hotel. I saw that. They were climbing walls outside his hotel. Yeah.
It was just remarkable. And that, in many ways, is a flex from Saudi Arabia. It is a flex from Saudi Arabia. It's look at them saying, look, you have made good with us. You've made peace with us. Look how we're going to bring you the best player in the world now just to play there. It is a flex from Saudi Arabia. It's not necessarily has to be the most ominous thing, but it goes to show you how they are changing the order and how things are played on the global stage right now. They are willing to partner up with countries that previously we would have thought they would never have done so. And then they emphasize that with these sports deals that come out thereafter, or these games, these opportunities for them to showcase just how much they've changed as a country. I am forever fascinated by how Saudi Arabia continues to utilize sports, Luke. It's really, really interesting because it's not necessarily like sports has to be the be-all, end-all, let's say here, but he is very smart in how he uses sports to magnify the changes taking place in Saudi Arabia. Another great example, and I'm using so many football ones because I think football is an extremely relevant sport, being the national sport and the most popular sport in the country. Al Nasr had this, for the Saudi National Days, Al Nasr released this video that had a lot of their players in Saudi traditional dresses and clothing, and sort of holding on to swords or Saudi traditional instruments, etc., performing Saudi folk dances. And this was really another one of those Saudi flexes. It's this display of propaganda, and at the same time, it is promoting Saudi nationalism, both domestically and abroad. It's a statement from Mohammed bin Salman saying, we're changing, and here's how we're changing, and we're going to use your favorite celebrities to push our brand and to show you how we're changing. It's really utterly fascinating here, which is why I said this is so multi-pronged. So even when you ask me what is the scope beyond sports washing, even that is broken down to so many different parts. We can talk about just the economic side, the alternative economics sectors that are being built. We can talk about tourism. We can talk about how this is a distraction for the youth, right? We can talk about the reputation laundering and all this sort of regional supremacy and jousting for supremacy that's taking place. There's so much to this, and it feels like it's its own book, let alone its own article at this point.
Let's focus on the combat sports side. So as I mentioned, UFC this week, it was revealed they're going to take not a pay-per-view, but a fight night to Riyadh at some point in 2024. PFL some months ago accepting a $100 million investment from the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. Excuse me, as you mentioned, WWE, which is not MMA obviously, but involved in the larger combat sports space. They've taken some. We saw the rematch between Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz, take place in Saudi Arabia. This upcoming fight with Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury. And of course, I could go on and on and on from there and many more. So let me ask the question this way. In 5 years, maybe 10, is Riyadh going to be the new capital of the fight sport world instead of Las Vegas?
Ooh, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. I do wonder whether it's still going to be. I don't think Las Vegas is in the picture in 5 to 10 years. Let's just start with that. I think it's still between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, if you're asking me.
Okay, tell me why. That's a great point. Tell me why.
I think there's a great case to be made that right now the epicenter is the United Arab Emirates. Forget Las Vegas for a while because it doesn't even hold the big boxing fights anymore. In my opinion, it's not going to last as far as I'm concerned. I still see we don't think of these other combat sports like jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu being the UAE's national sport now, according to the government, a sport that's mandated in schools, a sport that is used in police force and in the military, a sport that is practiced by the royal family, the Al Nahyan family in the United Arab Emirates. This is a sport that the country has used as a form of soft power and influence for many years, building cultural relations even with Brazil. I mean, you had President Lula visiting earlier this year, commending Prince or Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan right now, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan in the United Arab Emirates for his love of jiu-jitsu and for the relationship being built between Brazil and the UAE. I think we cannot forget just how significant the United Arab Emirates is when it comes to combat sports. I mean, they built jiu-jitsu from the ground up. There is no competitive jiu-jitsu without the UAEs, at least the amount that they invested in that in the 90s and the early 2000s with the ADCC onwards, right? And they continue to hold that influence with that sport. Not to mention, up until just last week, Luke, they were the exclusive home to the UFC in the Middle East and in the Arab world. The exclusive home. That was it, right? That was where you were going to watch the UFC. That's where they had built this relationship. They built even this brand of, the Fight Island, right? Which was also tourism to Yas Island for Abu Dhabi, right? So this all comes back to sort of the same concepts here. So I don't think the UAE intends to let go of that anytime soon. And if anything, I would make a case that part of Saudi Arabia's investment in mixed martial arts, in combat sports, given that this sport is much more of a niche and will not even reap in the attention that Saudi gets from these other sports strategy investments, I think this one is a lot more of regional jousting and sort of geopolitical rivalries between the two countries. I think Saudi Arabia, and I think particularly Mohammed bin Salman, wants to wrestle away that title from the UAE, that it's at least the region's center of combat sport, just because he can. And there's a long-standing rivalry between MBS and MBZ, MBZ being Mohammed bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates. So I think that that's absolutely factors in there. Saudi Arabia, though, it's really interesting. I think the investment with the PFL, it's hard to tell right now, Luke. Honestly, it is very, very hard to tell. $100 million is not a large stake. They did make it clear that this was an initial investment and that they could invest far more money into this. If we stand back and take a look at, what Saudi Arabia was able to do with Live Golf, then there could be a significant threat to entities like the UFC in the future if Saudi Arabia doesn't intend to go all into a company like the PFL. What I think is really strange, honestly, when I heard the announcement yesterday that the UFC is going to Saudi Arabia, is that they're taking a fight night. That is pretty pathetic, I have to admit. It's pretty pathetic, and it goes to show you that, honestly, I don't think they even know what they're in for here. Saudi Arabia now holds some of the biggest events out there. They're about to do, Ngannou versus Fury. They're about to have an even bigger boxing fight with Fury versus Usyk. And then the UFC is going to go with this limp card? Like, seriously? With a fight night? And here's the best bit. I bet you anything they're going to bring fighters from around the region and expect that to work. In Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia is definitely not going to care if there's a UAE fighter on the card or a Bahraini fighter on the card. They're not going to care. They're not going to care if there's an Egyptian. They want Saudis, right? Or they want the best of the best. So if you're not giving them championship fights, if you're not giving them what the UFC gives the UAE, that relationship is never going to last. It is never going to last. So I thought that was quite funny because if they're going to take a shitty card like that, there is no future for that relationship. On the other hand, I think they should consider it a threat that Saudi Arabia is investing in the PFL. I really do. This is not the exact same structure as Live Golf, but Saudi Arabia will be able to eventually lure more fighters to big contracts that the UFC is not willing to spend on anymore. They will. We've just seen this happen with Ngannou, right? And I know that the UFC has extremely restrictive contracts, but for those who are able to get out of contracts, or for those who are free agents, signing with the UFC will no longer be the be-all, end-all. I know right now it seems like there's never going to be anything but the UFC, but brands change all the time, and brands die out, and brands lose their abilities. And the arrogance of the UFC reminds me a lot of the arrogance of the PGA Tour, which early on, when Saudis first approached the PGA Tour, they approached them with the idea of a partnership. They said, let's partner up. We want to invest in you guys. And the PGA said, yeah, no thanks. We're good. How good are they now? How good are they?
Don't you remember? I think the president, I forget his official title, CEO, president, I'm not sure what it was, the head of the PGA, made a big, bold statement about the 9/11 families prior to this arrangement with Live Golf. And then the next time you see him, he's announcing a partnership with Saudi Arabia.
How disgusting is that? Weaponizing families who suffer through a tragedy just to make a political point against Saudi Arabia or against the Live Golf. That in itself was disgusting, and then to go back on it afterwards was even worse. But yeah, that goes to show you the state of well, I guess American sports in many ways, right? Like America is reaping what it sowed here, unfortunately, opening up minority stakes potentially in things like the NBA, etc. This is what's led to, Qatar making investments, right? Same thing's going to happen across sports, right? This is the endless pursuit of profit leads you into the arms of people like Saudi Arabia. This is just what has to happen if you have no regulatory pushback whatsoever. Like we're seeing a little bit of regulatory pushback right now with the PGA Live Golf investigation. But if it comes out that this was perfectly fine and this can move forward, well, this signals the end of, U.S. dominance over its own domestic leagues. It really does, right? And the influence moves to the hands of the most powerful. And the most powerful right now is, I'm sorry for Americans that are listening right now, it's not the United States. It's most certainly is not the United States, right? So there's a lot that's due to change here, and I think Saudi Arabia is proving its point. And combat sports is not going to be an exception. Like there is no this exceptionalism with the UFC that it's always going to survive. It will always be the biggest brand. I don't buy that anymore, Luke. I certainly don't.
Okay, a couple more questions for you. One is, what is happening inside the UAE, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia as they really lean on their own sovereign wealth funds and invest them? One thing I've seen from human rights organizations, and again, I wonder if you can comment on this, is that they believe that internal repression in Saudi Arabia is actually growing, that in fact they're getting even more paranoid. I saw some guy was, I think, either sentenced to death or life in prison in Saudi Arabia for just some tweeting. Famously, there was a Lebanese doctor who had said disparaging things about the UAE on Twitter. Then he arrives and they jail him. Give me a sense of domestically. You see a lot of people say Dubai is great, which I'm sure on some level, of course it is. But what is happening politically internally as these countries spread this wealth elsewhere? What's happening on the inside?
That really, really true, especially when it comes to, let's start with Saudi. When it comes to Saudi, I think it really depends on who you ask, because unfortunately, there's always going to be the privileged class that's not affected at all or not affected in any negative way by what's happening in the country, right? This applies really to every place you can think of. This would happen in Egypt under military dictatorship, in Saudi under its monarchy, etc. But I think there is no doubt. There is no doubt that repression is on the rise, and they're actually being far more aggressive and harsh and cruel, really, with their sentencing recently. There's a lot more people being sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of people being sentenced to decades upon decades in prison over social media posts, some of them which were anonymous to begin with and had, 50 to 60 followers maximum. So when I say it's cruel, it truly, truly is extraordinarily cruel. They're not even targeting the most prominent people on the internet anymore. They're simply looking for scapegoats to make a point. Do not open your mouth. Remember, Luke, earlier I said about this social contract that Mohammed bin Salman has with his people that they never got an option to sign in the first place, right? This is exactly that. Keep your mouth shut and I'll give you everything you want, right? Open your mouth and I'll take it all away from you. I'll take your life away from you. That's the name of the game here. This is not a democracy. This is not a place where you can express your opinions freely, especially your political opinions. This is a place where you face the consequences of such actions. And you know what? This extends far beyond politics. This idea is not just you have to be a dissident or against Mohammed bin Salman to suffer in Saudi Arabia. At the end of the day, there's a lot of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia who are also suffering, right? Dating back to when Mohammed bin Salman took power, he immediately jailed Lujain al-Hathloul, which was one of the most prominent women activists in Saudi Arabia, who just wanted to be able to drive her car. That's what she was doing. She was getting in a car and driving, and they jailed her for it, right? This is when Saudi was still presenting itself as this reformer for women, right? And women can do whatever they want in Saudi Arabia now, which is absolutely not true. Women still operate under the male guardianship in Saudi Arabia, and the women's rights activists who speak out against that suffer even more. It is no coincidence, Luke, that I think 4 of the 7 harsh sentences we have seen so far have been against women, speaking out simply for their own personal rights. I don't see the politics in that, honestly. I really don't anymore, right? The UAE, on the other hand, just to give you a quick note on the UAE, I think the UAE has always been lucky in the way Canada's lucky to be neighbors with the United States. Sort of It's honestly, US gets all the, the bad press, and Canada gets away with, being a lot more subtle about it, even though Canada can be quite as ruthless and as vicious as the United States. I think the UAE has the same advantage, being neighbors with Saudi Arabia. Everybody always targets Saudi Arabia primarily, but the UAE is remarkably cunning. The UAE is remarkably cunning. They are far smarter, not necessarily than Saudi, but they're one of the smartest autocratic states I can think of that has been able to weaponize not just sports, but pretty much any other facet that they can influence through soft power. They have a soft power council as part of the government. It's actually, funny enough, it's chaired by Sheikh Mansour, who owns Manchester City. So it goes to show you that it's very clear to them what they are doing. They know exactly what they're doing, and they've been doing it very well for a very long time. They've been using jujitsu as influence since the late 90s. This is nothing new for the United Arab Emirates, and they will continue to do this, and they will continue to be repressive at the same time. It's just nobody reports about them. There are poets right now in jail in the Emirates. Poets. Why would you jail a poet? You know why you would jail a poet? Because poetry actually has significant history of dissent in the region, right? From the Bedouin times onwards in the region, poets are usually the voices of truth, of justice. So yeah, believe it or not, the UAE is still terrified of its own poets. Its own poets, people who will write a few lines, that scares these autocrats. It always comes back down to the same thing for me, Luke, honestly, which is no matter how big these guys are, no matter how big they like to present themselves, Mohammed bin Salman, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, Mohammed bin Zayed in Paul Kagame in Rwanda, whoever it is, all these people will always have, they're still always, always going to come after the little guy. They're always still, no matter how big they are, they always still get mad at the smallest tweets. They're always still going to be insecure little men at the end of the day.
So we could go in a million different directions, but to kind of wrap on the conversation here, let me just posit a question to that. Something I've actually thought about a lot. I don't have a great answer. Maybe you do. If you look back in 1974, George Foreman, Muhammad Ali, Rumble in the Jungle, folks might be asking, why did this fight take place in Kinshasa, Zaire? And it's because Mobutu Sese Seko made it that way for sports washing purposes. So on some level, I guess my question would be, isn't there a long history of sports washing, especially inside combat sports? And I guess your answer would be yes, but what makes it different now, if I understand you correctly, is that the scale of what the Saudis could do with it vastly outstrips even what dictators from Zaire could do in the 70s or South African apartheid, for example, in the 80s and 90s. This is the level at which they can accomplish this is unseen in human history.
I think what Saudi Arabia is doing is absolutely unprecedented. Absolutely unprecedented. I think on the scale that they're able to apply this and the resources that they have, the sort of limitless at this point resources that they have backing them, I think this is unprecedented. But make no mistake about it, Luke, the reason we're able to analyze this to this extent also speaks to being in the age of social media. We are all a lot more aware generally of what's happening around us than before. We have far more media sources and actually just journalists dedicated to covering very specific niches now that didn't exist back in the day. So there wasn't really that much coverage back then of what was happening in Zaire to the average, Westerner. There really wasn't that much coverage, and just right thereafter, Thrilla and Manila was no better, right? That was the same thing, but nobody talked about it back then. We're able to look back on it now. We're able to go back now and analyze, the 1936 Olympics, Hitler's Olympics, Nazi Germany's Olympics, right?
Right.
But those still took place then. It took place. Nobody boycotted it, right? So it goes to show you just how these topics have changed over time. The general social consensus around these topics have changed, and our willingness to debate and discuss them has also changed, right? But at the same time, we're dealing with modern, intelligent, authoritarian states, and just generally states and governments in general that have learned from history and know how to not repeat those mistakes in the past and actually be far better at their sports washing and their sports strategies moving forward.
Karim, if folks want more of your work, where can they get it?
So I still do lots of work for the New York Times, for the Guardian, etc. You will find me always on Twitter as well. But I also run my own newsletter covering the intersection of sports, power, and politics. It's called Sports Politica. I would love it if you could subscribe there.
There you have it. Karim Zidan, one of the best, one of the most unique, and one of the most important. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom. I'm sure we will talk sooner than the last time we talked. That gap will be much shorter. Thank you so much.
And I will look forward to it then as well, Luke. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.